the thought crystallized in my head as a young M&E professional of actually getting more interested in the monitoring side of things than the evaluation by trying to take on a little bit more freight.
I mean, I'm impressed that you arrived at thoughtfulness well before the field began to embrace evaluative thinking.
I'm a field guy.
Greetings. I'm Michael Quinn Patton, inviting you to join me for a conversation with Daniel Ticehurst about thoughtful monitoring in the monitoring and evaluation arena. This conversation is occasioned by a position I took in the book Developmental Evaluation Exemplars, in which I contrasted monitoring with developmental evaluation, basically arguing that ongoing monitoring, the M in M&E, monitoring and evaluation, typically involves tracking predetermined indicators, progress on those predetermined indicators, and that because the indicators are predetermined and standardized and focus on quarter-to-quarter and year-to-year comparisons to report progress against predetermined targets, they are fairly useless for picking up unintended consequences and emergent developments. In other words, they are very useful for developmental evaluation. The data from monitoring serves best to track progress against implementation plans, primarily for accountability purposes. Well, as Daniel Ticehurst came across this position, he wrote me by email and suggested that monitoring could be thoughtful and that thoughtful monitoring could well play a developmental evaluation purpose. And so we began a dialogue that led to this conversation. Basically, what he argued was that thoughtful monitoring could support monitoring approaches that evolve over time as information needs change along with the needs of client beneficiaries, interest holders, the intended users of the evaluation and monitoring system. And that thoughtful monitoring could ensure that monitoring is driven by the needs of managers and helps them treat the intended client beneficiary, their goals, and their culture as king. It is beneficiaries who legitimize development and humanitarian aid, and it is their indigenous knowledge systems that we need to learn from, he suggested. He went on to say that thoughtful monitoring could generate lessons that provide evidential reasons for adapting through becoming accountable to client beneficiaries, and that thoughtful monitoring could help monitoring approaches and systems better reflect and be attuned to the complex operating environment in which they occur. One approach or system does not fit all situations, but thoughtful monitoring could be adapted to a relevant situation. And finally, he said that thoughtful monitoring could recognize that thoughtful monitoring would be a cure for obsessing about indicators and measuring results, for there is more to monitoring than this if it's done thoughtfully. So Daniel had written a blog making these points, and we decided to have a conversation to pursue the relationship between developmental evaluation and monitoring. We began the conversation by asking Daniel to share his background, how he got into evaluation, what his early experiences were. Here's Daniel Ticehurst.
First started in 1988 in Zimbabwe, and I was using tools that were then called rapid rural appraisal that morphed into participatory rural appraisal, developed by Chambers and that kind of family. But I used it for kind of M&E. At the time, they were using it mainly for appraisal in the strict sense of the word, in terms of planning. And I used them on micro-scale irrigation schemes. My interest was prompted, although there was a lag effect. My father took me to see a talk by Christopher Hitchens on George Orwell about thinking and inquiry and and this is before he went to the States, and George Orwell and Hitchens, and I came away with some things that really inform me still about principles about how truth matters even when it's uncomfortable, how authority should be questioned, not trusted blindly, and how independence of thought is a moral responsibility. I've always had those, although I was young at that age and I wasn't going to pursue a career in monitoring and evaluation at that point. I was only 20 and still at university. But those things still hold with me very much. But that's when I started, was really in Zimbabwe in the late 80s, down in a place called Majiwa in the southern area of Zimbabwe.
Between the two of us, we've got more than 80 years of experience together. So hopefully that will encourage people to pay some attention. So let's pick up with what prompted your thoughts on thoughtful monitoring. And part of this is a sort of baseline that I argued in the developmental evaluation book, that monitoring tended to be oriented toward reporting, to be routine, to be standardized, to be a compliance activity, and that while in principle it had a developmental and adaptive purpose, the way it actually got done didn't really support that, because it was treated as routine. In fact, the data people who did it often didn't even have connection with decision makers. They were simply reporting to funders. And you acknowledge that baseline, but I've said it doesn't have to be like that and shouldn't be like that, that monitoring should be thoughtful. A really important word, thoughtful. So tell me about what brought you to that, and what your vision of a thoughtful monitoring is.
So what brought me to it was after Zimbabwe, I lived in Malawi and did a load of randomized control trials for an old World Bank cotton project that had invested throughout the 60s and 70s. And it's called the Lower Shire of Malawi. And I had a supervisor from the World Bank who helped me do it was an classic ex post evaluation. So to cut a long story short, I got taught how to do it, did it, I think, okay. And I presented it to the managers and all the technical specialists in the government division I was working in as head of evaluation. And they came up to me afterwards and said, this is really interesting, but what do we do with this information? It was demanded by the World Bank. The cotton project's gone. What doesn't tell us what to do? It's too descriptive. It just tells you what was achieved and what wasn't, but it didn't really explain why and how and so on. And this is really kind of deep methodological issues around control groups, around incremental gross margin analysis, looking at performance of cotton in varying scenarios. And then I suddenly realized what you said earlier was there's nothing in between. There's either kind of you wait for an evaluation to come along and spend 6 months doing something that doesn't really tell you what to do, i.e. the people on the ground delivering the work. And the monitoring just describes what happened over the last 3 months, just a catalogue of activities and outputs, and at best how much that cost, although that people even struggle with that. So that's when I suddenly realized how there's a gap, and monitoring, valuation can't do it because of the timing necessarily, and managers need information beyond just telling the donor what they already know anyway without having to write it down. So that's where the thought crystallized in my head as a young M&E professional of actually getting more interested in the monitoring side of things than the evaluation, by trying to take on a little bit more freight as part of the monitoring function, in terms of asking myself, why is it done? It has to be useful for the people. Otherwise, as you say, the people responsible for reporting up to donors by cataloguing what's done and what's been delivered are going to get isolated or separated from the people who actually do the work day in, day out. And please tell them something they don't know. So that's when I thought about how to be more question oriented in monitoring and focusing very much on outcomes as behavioral change. And that's what fascinated me, the interaction between the supply and the demand of the support amongst those intended to benefit from the support. No more, no less, not about the consequences of using something like yields or incomes, but just how they respond to the stimuli that's put out there. And that fascinated me as an economist in terms of behaviors and what stimulates behaviors, what encourages people to reject something, what are the kind of multiplier effects on that in communities about if some families reject something, what do they talk to about with their neighbors about things. And so that's when I really started using some of those participatory techniques and listening. And I learned a lot from Lawrence Salmon's work in the late 80s at the bank about what he calls beneficiary assessments. It's mainly qualitative, but as Chambers said, qualitative inquiry generates some quite useful numbers as well. So I got completely enthralled by all that, really, Michael. And then I took that with me to Uganda, where I worked for USAID for 3 years on an action program for the environment. And that's when I stumbled into kind of organizational systems and how this fits or not, and tripped up several times. USAID funded a lot of NGOs in different parts of Uganda, and they needed an M&E framework, and they needed to instill it into their contractors or partners. And it made me understand more about how thoughtful monitoring is about understanding how to fit things in that don't overwhelm people, rather than having a contrived M&E desk or officer or unit with M&E specialists and so on, and how to manage those tensions and how to make sure that they are M&E processes are in tune with other processes that organizations have to develop, like decision-making processes, financial monitoring, not just non-financial monitoring. They talk to each other, and then the delivery systems and all of that. So for me, what started off as a methodological thing started to go into management and how to focus thoughtful monitoring in management systems whilst learning lessons as to what to avoid. And I remember my old boss from the World Bank said, having a special M&E unit within a program or a project is the kiss of death to monitoring evaluation.
In a way, what I've experienced in your thinking about thoughtful monitoring is elevating the M in M&E to beyond a compliance activity to be meaningful. So the M represents meaningful monitoring. It's also management and evaluation. M&E is managing and evaluation, meaningfulness
Yeah.
and evaluation, monitoring and evaluation, making it meaningful. So tell us what you've learned about how to make it thoughtful. How do you make monitoring thoughtful? What's it take?
And doubt, and it legitimizes uncertainty. I think that's really important in the settings that developmental evaluation is put to work in terms of complexity and uncertainty. And I think that it thoughtful monitoring challenges the kind of the reward of certainty and the reward of being right every time, and so it does legitimize uncertainty and also reward it. And I think it prioritizes learning over reporting. Needn't be as mundane as it is. I know that it gets a bad name, but a report is simply a kind of a product of a good monitor, of thoughtful monitoring. So reports can be good and they can be not so good and rather distorted and be too late. But I think to be thoughtful in terms of the monitoring, I think for starters, it's got to be understanding what the purpose of monitoring is, in terms of what it's about and how to assess it. It is about, for me, improving the kind of implementation performance and prospects for lasting change. Not to prove lasting change, but improve the prospects for it by looking at kind of leading signs. But I gave some thought, and although I had many, I think there are 5 standout features of how you would characterize thoughtful monitoring, which is it's got to be user-centered and decision-focused. I think that's really important from my experience in Malawi and so on. It's got to be attuned to what people need to make decisions on, what their decision uncertainties are, and it's got to be owned by management. It can't be imposed by a donor. Although there is an accountability to donors, it shouldn't dominate. The main objective of monitoring is to help resolve those decision uncertainties and inform decisions. So it starts very much about understanding the needs of implementers and managers. And you need to do that. You need to have those discussions first up or with an organization. That is, as opposed to beginning with a predefined theory of change or results for a framework and running it from there. If that's your starting point, you're starting off on the wrong foot. You lose probably half your audience if that's how you start thinking about developing an M&E system. If the first starting point is to develop a theory of change or a log frame, or both, or one if you prefer one over the other, it doesn't bother me. It's starting off on the wrong foot.
Based management system in international agencies really does impose a framework of monitoring on management, so they don't get any opportunity to be making that meaningful to them. They're given what they're supposed to monitor.
Happens if you wanted the antithesis of thoughtful monitoring, it would be results-based management or monitoring and results measurement, which I would label as thoughtless monitoring.
Yeah, its pretense is that it's able to aggregate from many different projects up to give the International Agency Board of Directors a view of what's going on. But we know, in fact, it doesn't do that. It's so vague, it's so aggregated, it's so overgeneralized that it doesn't really tell a board at an international agency what's going on the ground.
No, it's too abstract and restricts everything.
The thing that strikes me about what you've said is that the results-based management monitoring systems tend to primarily be providing donors with data about what the project does, what the managers do. But you've talked about the importance of actually basing the monitoring system on what's happening to participants, what
Yes.
behaviors are going on with participants. And that's a different kind of monitoring than simply reporting what management is doing up the line. You want to know what's happening to participants.
Yeah, it's kind of affording primacy to indigenous knowledge systems and understanding how they work and how they respond, and giving that legitimacy as part of the overall thoughtful monitoring piece. But thoughtful monitoring is also it is interested in what management does, the triggers and how much that costs and how well that's done. But it doesn't stop there. It needs to go beyond that and understand how intended beneficiaries or clients, whoever you want to call them, they could be decision makers in the ministry, or they could be community individuals, groups, how they're responding. In other words, to directly look at, in a way, treat the assumptions with more importance than the actual indicators that you're making about how people respond, are not very well done and researched, and often forgotten when it comes to actually the M&E. And I learn a lot from private sector practice. I did some work for the impact investors not so long ago, and private sector now, the impact investors, they had what they call customer insights. So they're really wanting to understand their customers, about their situations, their needs, and all of that, and putting that front and center of decisions by investors in where to put money, where not to put money, where to stop things, where to start expanding things. And so I've learned a lot from the private sector as well.
It strikes me that thoughtful monitoring with participants would also help participants be thoughtful about what's happening to them. That is, the customer orientation of the private sector in some ways assumes that participants already know what they need or want, and you just ask them the question and it's all there. But in fact, they have to go through a thought process of figuring out what they need, what they want, that's not automatic. So thoughtful monitoring ought to be both thoughtful for managers, but thoughtful for participants to stimulate their thinking about what's happening to them.
I think that's a really good point, actually, because the onus of my work has been very much on the management side of things. It helps you understand not just, yeah, exactly what you just said, not what they think, but how they're thinking about things and what preferences they have, and it's getting to think about what they how they respond to the service as a product or a service, um, and do they really need it? They must be going through decision making thinking on, do they want this? Are they going to try it? Should they try it? And if they try it, what success looks like for them in terms of the benefits they'll realize from it, and so on. So that's a really good point.
Yeah.
So those are the kinds of things I talked about which fascinate me, is how people you're wanting to support, how they make decisions, what they go through, how thoughtful, as you say, what are their thought processes, what are they thinking of, what makes them say yay or nay to certain things. And that's always intrigued me, and also how that differs from year to year, from group to group, perhaps. So yeah.
So I mean, I do think that the challenge of getting thoughtfulness both in evaluation and monitoring and having them connected more and getting people to think about what's going on um, in this current environment makes it all the more difficult since again we're back to ideological um, ideology trumping thinking literally and
Yeah.
uh, and so to get people to be thoughtful about what's going on in the ground.
Will, there was one other thing that I wanted to say on thoughtful
Please.
monitoring that I forgot to say. And then I think what really became important to me was when we talk about participatory M&E, we associate participatory M&E with giving voice to people that matter most, those in need, the underserved, client beneficiaries, whoever we want to call them. Whereas some people who are typically forgotten and get left out are the people who work in the field, like the extension workers, the health workers, the advisors who are cast adrift in the Ministry of Finance or wherever and taught to. Sometimes, more often than you would like or hope to expect, their voice is limited to just a report that then gets pulled together and aggregated up and into the kind of scenario you were referring to earlier in terms of a report to the board or to the funder. And giving that silence comes at a price. I think it stifles innovation and adaptation in relatively quick time, because I stumbled across a technique, an approach called anecdote circle storytelling, that some private sector companies are using. I've never come across it in the field of development, where you read all the reports. I worked with a colleague in Nigeria for 5 years on this. You read all their individual reports, you identify things that are bothering them or things that are going well, and you pull them together into storytelling circles. And it's not a focus group interview. You get them just to talk to each other about, triggered by kind of emotional phrases like, what most surprised you in the last couple of months? How do you cope with rejection? What do you do? And out of that comes a kind of sense making of things that they learn from each other, because they never met before, although they're doing the same job in different parts of. In this case, it was federal ministries in Abuja and Lagos in Nigeria, but it could be extension workers who might not ever meet in different parts of the region or the district, and you pull them together. And I'd like thoughtful monitoring is kind of, that's very much participatory in nature, and it's really important. I'm not saying that their perceptions of change are more important or telling them the people who are changing and responding, like farmers and others. But their insights are often not captured in these reports, as you say, because they have to report against predetermined indicators and objectives and outcomes and in some log frame or theory of change. But it gives them that chance to share their experiences together and to learn from each other. So that we found out that in many cases there were some advisors who had tripped up on something and couldn't get back up, and there were other advisors, and even in a different ministry, who'd encountered the same issue and learned to overcome it. So you get that interaction. It's not a performance assessment. It's about telling each other stories.
So you've really identified, in addition to helping managers be more thoughtful, helping create a situation where the field people can be thoughtful and honest about their experiences, and then participants, um, the intended beneficiaries, have a chance to be thoughtful about what their experience is. And if you actually get that combined thoughtfulness of managers and field people and beneficiaries talking to each other in real ways, that that's not just data, that's part of the intervention process. And that's how I came to developmental evaluation, is that it's, that this kind of thoughtfulness becomes part of the change process. It's not just data, it's not reporting, it is
Yeah,
intrinsic to making development work.
absolutely. And
I mean, I'm impressed that you arrived at thoughtfulness well before the field began to embrace evaluative thinking. Evaluative thinking became a big deal about a decade ago, but you've been
okay.
dealing with this for a lot longer. And um,
Yes. Well, dealing with it, I kind of, it's funny you say that because um, if I was to be frank with you, I got rather intimidated by the evaluation field itself because I'm a field guy, and I've always found writing difficult. I wasn't academic at all. My first career when I left school was I played cricket. I didn't even want to go to university. So if I'm brutally honest with myself and with you as part of this chat, I always found the kind of academic overhang regarding evaluation is rather intimidating, both as a youngster and even now. And I regret that. But I think that the field experience is I learned. Yes, I'd like to think I'm kind of lettered in terms of I've read a lot, but also I think nothing beats that. It's that field experience, Michael, that you really need to ground you to become a consultant, to become a professional. You've really got to live and breathe it in a program and organization. And that's something that I would really encourage the younger generation to get, because you don't forget that. And it's very instructive.
yeah.
Yeah.
Thoughtfulness is much needed these days at every level, and I appreciate your bringing your history and thoughtfulness to the topic. We'll look forward to more of your insights. Thanks for taking the time to do this.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you so much, Michael, for the opportunity and for your writings too. I think they're wonderful. So thank you. Thank you.
All